Welcome to another edition of Living with Purpose. Today, I have a very interesting guest with a kind of different background than most people that come on my podcast. I have Susie James. She is both an entrepreneur, a business owner, somebody that has run a business for a long time, but she has also got her doctorate. So she is a researcher and is doing a lot of work around adoption and rescue. And she has both affiliations in the academic space, the nonprofit and social impact space, and has also been a business leader. So please join me in welcoming Susie to the podcast. Susie, welcome.
Hi, really nice to meet you. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
You're very welcome. So let's start off, but just talk about your journey, your growth. Where did you grow up? The lifestyle that you had in your family. What were some seminal important moments there?
Sure. So I was born in the 60s actually, and I was born in London, and it was in the time when um, single unmarried mothers were forced to relinquish babies. And so I was adopted by my parents. My father was a GP and psychiatrist, my mother a nurse, and they lived in Oxford. So I grew up in Oxford in a very large house. We had the surgery and waiting room in the house. There was just the three of us and our cat. And
Mm,
I had an amazing upbringing in terms of the opportunities I was given. I went to an incredible school and built enormous friendship groups. I was very shy, and I have to say that in the background there were layers of sort of a lack of safety underneath
mm,
in my home background. We gave off the veneer of kind of affluent middle class home, but my parents were alcoholics. And
mm.
so I grew up with some challenges, shall we say. But the flip side of that is that I grew up with an incredible sense of culture. So my father had a variety of patients at that time, some of whom owned theatres and the Playhouse in Oxford. So every month I would be taken to either a ballet, opera, or some kind of play. So I did grow up with great culture, and we would go on holiday to France every year. And I made friends actually with French children. So from a really early age, I spoke French. I had to because they didn't speak English. And so languages really became an enormous kind of almost obsession of mine. And I love languages. And languages always stood out throughout my whole school life, perhaps some of the countries I've lived in. Yeah, it's played a huge role. And actually, the interesting side of that is that having those languages allowed me to inhabit another identity. And I love the term you used in another of your podcasts, multiplicity, because I feel that I inhabited quite a variety of identities, which allowed me to explore a sense of self, really. But languages was one of the conduits for that.
So that's so interesting, right? That all of us kind of have these different layers of our life, and what is on the surface is never really the full picture. And this notion that you are able to share that is wonderful for our audiences to kind of understand that growing up is never a simple line. It is always full of contours and turns and twists. And that what you grab onto that allows you to then think about how you thrive. So the fact that you focused on languages and languages as a way to actually really build your self worth, not worth, but self identity, or one of your identities, I think is just fantastic. So, talk a little bit about schooling and then how did you get into the space that you initially started off in?
Yeah, sure. So at school, as I said, I was extremely shy and kind of lacked confidence, not with my friends, but in speaking up. I just struggled a little bit. But as my strong friendship group was incredible and they have lasted my whole life. They really have been a huge part of my growth, my journey and loyalty. And when I went into the senior school, my father had gone to the school and said to the head, "My daughter will be arriving in September. So just let me know which form she'll be in." And the head said, "No, there isn't a there isn't a place for her. So I'm afraid you'll have to find somewhere else." And
Hmm.
he said, "No, no, she'll be there." And they said, "Well, there's no place." So in September, my father took me in and said, "Where should I take her?" And so I just give that little snippet of a story because my father never accepted the word no. And apart from being highly conscientious with this kind of contrast of a party using alcohol as a release, but he was highly conscientious and really very, very determined. I mean, he was from the valleys in Wales, from a one-horse tiny village, and
Hmm.
yet he got to Cambridge, and then from Cambridge he got to St Thomas's, and from St Thomas's into the Navy. So somewhere along the line, he had very, very high standards. And so on the one hand, I sought approval and felt I let him down. I was never very good at maths or sciences. It was languages always. But on the other hand, I did take that determination and that kind of ability to move through blockages and obstacles when people turned around and said no to me, which would come later in business. And so on leaving school, where I did A levels in languages, I didn't want to go to university because I knew I couldn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. I just felt I wouldn't be good enough. And if I wasn't good enough to go there, it seemed pointless to go anywhere, which was ridiculous, but that was just the standards I think my father expected of me. So I didn't go to university. I did bear in mind it was the early 80s then, and I did a secretarial course, a bilingual secretarial course.
Hmm.
Kind of was expected to get a job and at some point get married. I would toe the line and go and do a job, a secretarial job in London, which I wasn't very good at. But and my parents never gave me money. I would save the money for an air ticket to go somewhere to travel. I just wanted to travel and I would work wherever I traveled to. But then I would come back, and so it was a kind of cycle that was on repeat until I came back to London around the late 80s when mobile phones had just arrived on the scene, and they were pretty costly, around £3,000, to buy those heavy Panasonics or Motorola's. I worked as a PA for a guy who'd set up a business around this, and they were quite difficult to sell. And so I suggested, how about renting them? Why don't we rent them on a short-term basis? He said, "Don't go into business because you haven't got a clue. You haven't got a clue what he's saying." So I said, "Okay." And I left and I met up with a very old family friend who's an accountant who has his head on his shoulders. It kind of always gives the voice of reason. I always had very high energy and very enthusiastic. And I'm very, very visual. So I had in my mind exactly what this idea was about, that I wanted to short-term hire mobile phones. And I initially went round the Hilton, the Lanesborough, the Claridge's, the Dorchester, all the large exclusive hotels in London. And I made friends with the concierges and had leaflets done, and I called it Capital Phone Hire. And I persuaded them to rent mobile phone to their guests who were visiting from overseas. And that is basically, in a nutshell, how I built my business. My mother was dying at the time. She was very ill. My parents died a long, long time ago. And she gave me £3,000 for my first phone. That was my driving force and my motivation for making this thing work. I was absolutely fierce and determined about it. I basically was running around London delivering these phones, which I charged by the day and by the click, like a taxi meter. And it grew I had no business background at all. And I really have to say that I was running by the seat of my pants. Eventually, I had to get an office space. I had thousands of phones out there. I contacted all the film companies who have runners and things. So I
Mm,
was renting phones to film companies and just it expanded. And I had a client who was based in New York. He was French and used to do chateau and barge holidays for American clients coming to France. And he came over, we met up, and he said, I need an office space in London. I said, sure, have a chair and a desk in my office. But I want a space in yours because I want to replicate what I'm doing here in New York. So that's what we did. And then I had an arrangement with Vodafone for the airtime. British Airways had a short-term hire company called Visitel, which I then started to manage. So passengers coming off the plane
mm.
would get handed a mobile phone. And then in my mind, I just visualized, I realized this visual aspect of my mind was really powerful. I kind of I've used it ever since. I see everything in pictures and kind of mini films. I kind of feel the experience physically, which sounds strange, but I can literally go into it and visualize a scene. And so I did a kind of I visualized Vodafone buying my short-term hire company, which was small. I had thousands of
Mm,
phones, and it was a good little business. Vodafone approached me to buy 51% of the company, and then
mm.
ultimately they bought all of it, including the US-based company. All of that came from just an enormous sense of belief, almost like visual orienteering towards a goal.
That is so fascinating, right? This is so fascinating that how you were able to just set yourself on a path and not move from it and just will yourself towards making something happen. And you were constantly visualizing your journey. So now you've kind of been in this phone business, you kind of running around, you're an entrepreneur, you're mostly selling, smoozing clients. And then from there, something shifted
Mhm.
that got you to get a PhD, to do research, and really focus on a whole completely different topic, which obviously is another layer of you because it comes from who you are. So, talk a little bit about that.
Well, actually, just before that, after selling the phone hire business, I actually embarked on another business after seeing mobile credit card terminals, just the terminals we use every day, the portable terminal.
Yeah,
I started a business around that, and I built a business over 16 years around card payment terminals, both the three long-term leasing of those terminals, which weren't around in the UK at that time, not these portable ones that used SIM cards.
right,
Then I also applied the same model of a short-term hire version for concerts for anyone on the move, like
right.
RTC, AA. So that was in 2001, and I built that over years and sold that in 2014. During that time, where again I recognized that the people with these card machines were looking for someone to explore that as a business. It was timing, and I thought, this is it. This is absolutely it. I've got to do this. And 2004, I gave birth to my daughter, and that's when I moved out of London. I did not move myself away from the business, but I put an MD in charge who was already working inside the business,
Hmm.
who I'd known for many years, was bringing up my daughter down here on the South Coast. And I separated from um, her father a few years later, although we've always remained friends. And I, being an adopted person, I always wanted to adopt a child. And I did a psychology degree. So I went to university for the first time. That was seriously hard, but I wanted to understand more about child development and particularly when it came to adoption and some of the adversities. I adopted my son in 2011, and that is what led me into it it was the intersection between the lived experience and the challenges of accessing post-adoption support that drove me really to try and gain some traction and authority around post-adoption support as a single adoptive parent, because I discovered that I wasn't the only one struggling to access support, which was promised, after the court order of adoption is passed, you're promised support, and really there isn't any. And there are so many adoptive families who are facing enormous challenges. There isn't the support there, and there isn't the support around adoption sensitive trauma. These the system has not been trained around the adversity and the experiences that children from care face, and the impact of that is lifelong. It's not just, oh, just supply
Mhm.
support in the early days. It is lifelong. Society pays a much higher cost when the support is not given. So that led me to pursue a doctoral research into this area to try and gain some real authority around this topic, and turn these challenges, kind of transmute it into something that was really aligned with who I am and purpose. So that's where
So
I am still. I'm in my second, coming up to third year of my PhD.
this is so fascinating. And since you brought up purpose, let's talk a little bit about that. Talk about why has purpose been so important for you? And clearly you have been driven by purpose. So talk a little bit about how that manifested for you and how that is unfolding for our listeners.
For me, I know now. So I didn't recognize what purpose meant early on, if you like. But as time has gone on, I've recognized that purpose is a feeling that lives inside. It's a sense of alignment. For me, it's something that I feel. I have to feel it emotionally, physically, spiritually. It's something that I recognize internally. I know when I am doing something which is purposeful because it comes from somewhere deep inside, and it comes with passion as well, and it feels authentic. So purpose for me is authenticity, because without authenticity there's nothing. I could, it's I can't do superficial, or I think it's something that for me, I am adoption at this point in life. And I recognize that all the experiences that have led up to this point, if you like, in a way, the businesses, and having to think on my feet, and having to lead others, employ others within my business, and holding, I was responsible for quite a few people, which is really meaningful. I think that those businesses gave me the tools to create the endurance I needed to pursue what I'm doing now. That's the way I can put it, really.
This you've actually introduced a very interesting word, and I just want us to kind of reflect on it. I mean, I completely agree with you that purpose is something that lives and grows inside of you. And once you start recognizing that, or even if it's not recognizing that, once you start sensing it, that actually leads to your showing up with authenticity. And I talk about that all the time, that purpose leads to authenticity. What you have just introduced is this very interesting concept, and I want you to just talk a little bit more about that. That through purpose, you show up with authenticity, but with authenticity, you can actually endure. And that to me is a very fascinating concept of endurance, because so many studies that have been done on people's by psychologists at universities like Cornell and others, they have seen that people with purpose overcome obstacles. And endurance is actually a fantastic term for that. So, talk a little bit about how you see endurance playing out.
So, because I am someone who always sees the bigger picture of things, and I've explained how incredibly visual I am. So the opposite side of that is that I may miss detail. I am flexible and I can move with change because things do change along a journey. And I feel that without flexibility, you can't remain rigid because we can't control external circumstances. However, detail matters. Detail matters massively. That was something I did recognize in myself early on in those businesses. So what I did was I wrote down those weaknesses, things that I'm not good at, detailed things that I'm not good at, and found those people like that amazing accountant that I needed. I needed the voice of reason. I needed people who were good at detail. I needed people who were good at administration. I have a poor attention span, used to a poor attention span for administration, paperwork, detail. I've grown to become very detailed actually through this PhD. But what I have recognized with this endurance thing is that in life things can become mundane. Things, even with the most amount of passion within that purpose, there's still some mundane things that we have to attend to. A lot of detail, but and because of this big picture and my attention, my the ease at which I can go off on tangents and have these incredible ideas. I go down rabbit holes. I have to refocus. I always come back to having that bigger picture up in front of me when I have to do the huge Excel spreadsheets of for a literature review or some statistical analysis of something or create surveys or whatever it is, the endurance required to climb this mountain, which is how I see it. And that applies to anything, I must say. It's about climbing a mountain, and you don't have to do it all at once. You just take block by block. And to be able to stay in the present with what you have creates the tenacity, the attention, the will to stay with what you have and yet see the bigger picture and just congratulate yourself on the steps that you make and the steps that you achieve. And when you think that you've done nothing, I don't look at it like that anymore. So I seriously appreciate every little step I make.
This has been such a fascinating conversation, and we've, run out of our time, but I want you to, I know you've just talked about your nugget, your one golden nugget, but maybe you can reframe it for our listeners in terms of your one golden nugget and a message that you have for them.
I think my one golden nugget has to be never ever give up. Never give up and never accept no. Because unless I don't really accept no as a response. There's always a solution to a problem. Even if we have to back off, there's always a solution.
On that note, this has been such a great conversation. I am always a solution seeker, not a problem solver. And I keep telling my audience that if you put on a frame of solution seeking, then there is no no, because you're always in the mode of discovery and looking at new things and new opportunities, because there is something that you are going to find that will lead to a solution. Susie, you are a solution seeker, somebody that is through your life and through your journey always looking at opportunities and opportunities that lead to value to people. Thank you so very much for being on this podcast. Again, to our listeners, purpose is that source of renewable energy that continues to guide humanity forward. Purpose is within yourself, it seeps out, it evolves. It's something that you experience, which allows you to show up with authenticity. And now, as Susie has added to it, that it actually then allows you to endure because you never take no for an answer. With that, Susie,
No,
thank you so very much for being on the podcast.
thank you so much. I've really, really enjoyed it. Thank you.